Okay, good. Okay, so this webinar is going to cover a description of the Southwest FireCLIME Vulnerability Assessment Tool. And initially, we were going to do this to kind of give the team an update on progress so far in the tool, but we've expanded the purpose of this a little bit to include kind of an introduction for some folks that we're hoping to work with on future case studies, as well as some other folks that are maybe interested in adapting or creating a similar system for their purposes. So for that reason, I'm trying to cover a lot of bases, I guess, with this presentation. And so I've broken it kind of into 3 parts. I'm going to go over and provide a really brief introduction, kind of history of where this vulnerability assessment tool has come from. And then I'll go into detail about the nuts and bolts of the tool. And that'll take probably about 15 minutes, I think. And then I will show you the tool. It's in an Excel file right now, and we'll go through the various components of the tool. And I think that would be probably another 15 to 20 minutes, and you'll get to see some examples of results. And then the final segment is to actually look at some of the outputs from some case study iterations that we're doing right now based on literature reviews. And so that's kind of a third component, and probably another 10 to 15 minutes. So this is going to be actually about 45 minutes of presentation, but you can drop off as you wish if you've gotten what you need from this. I have tried to kind of make it these distinct products. And so, okay, let me get this going here.
This is Martha. I just want to quick add that hopefully everyone can see the chat function here on Zoom. And especially if you need to duck out early, feel free to type in any questions that you may have as we go along, and we can get those answered at the end. And if you are not able to stay for the whole time, we can, we'll send out a summary and we can try to address those for you.
Okay, that's a really good point. Yeah, you can always chime in. And so, and then Martha, if anybody asks something via the chat, I can't see any boxes or anything, so please feel free to interrupt anybody at any time if you want me to, if you have questions or anything like that, but I may need that little facilitation. Okay, so we're talking about our vulnerability assessment tool, and if I can get this to go forward, there we go. So this tool was developed as part of this Southwest FireCLIME project. This is a JFSP funded project, and the title here, Landscape Impacts of Fire and Climate Change in the Southwest, a Science Management Partnership. So there's a pretty big team that's listed here on the right-hand side, comprised of a lot of researchers and managers, kind of really trying to address that science management partnership to help us provide a better understanding of these landscape impacts of fire and climate change. That's nice how I said the whole title in a different way. So this is kind of the origins of where this tool has come from. It was focused, this project is focused in the Southwest, but the tool is actually, I think, useful for systems outside of the Southwest. At least that's how we've been thinking about it in its design in many respects. So the objectives of this overall project are listed here to synthesize current knowledge of fire climate dynamics. This is really a complex situation that managers are having to deal with, and there's this need to identify what we know and what we don't, to assess the vulnerability of Southwestern ecosystems to shifts in climate and fire regimes, to model climate fire vegetation interactions, and to determine whether management actions are able to reduce some of the ecosystem impacts or vulnerabilities under a range of future climates. And so the underlying project has been developed in multiple stages, but they're not necessarily discrete stages. A lot of them are like our stage 1, the literature synthesis was started up, and that informs later stages like the vulnerability assessment and the modeling. And I mention this because there's a lot of activities that have gone on with this project that have fed into how we've developed this vulnerability assessment and why it's designed the way it is. And so primary amongst this is, of course, the literature review. This was something that needs to be done just to get a handle on what kind of information we have. Also, from the perspective of a vulnerability assessment, it really helped us identify the knowledge that was relevant for measuring vulnerability, and even those critical information gaps, so that we weren't basing our vulnerability assessment on things that we would not be able to get information about. There's also a series of science manager workshops, manager science workshops, as part of this project, and they have multiple purposes. From the perspective of the vulnerability assessment, though, they've been really helpful for critiquing some of the literature-based assumptions about fire and climate interactions, essentially asking participants if what you can summarize from the literature sources kind of jive with their feelings of how these things work actually in their ecosystems and out in the field. As well, these workshops provide an opportunity to identify indicators of vulnerability, and I'll talk about that more in the future, but we really tried to find indicators that would resonate with managers, so that essentially the vulnerability assessment would be speaking the same language as the managers do, because this is meant to be a tool for managers to help in their decision-making processes. And so you have to make it relevant to what's going on in that world. We have some of the team members have already completed some modeled projections for southwestern ecosystems under different climate fire management scenarios, and these have also been helpful for outlining and testing maybe some ideas with respect to these fire climate interactions and their effects on ecosystems. And then finally, of course, we've been developing this framework to measure vulnerability of ecosystems. Again, the goal to measure vulnerability under different climate, fire, and management scenarios. So some of you have seen this graphic a lot, but others maybe not so much. And it's kind of core to the idea here of why we're using vulnerability assessments. And so what you see here, actually, and I forgot to turn on my pointer. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, yeah, do you guys see a dot? This looks really good from my perspective, so hopefully it's working.
Yep.
Okay, good, thanks. So here we have a kind of conceptual diagram of vulnerability. Vulnerability down here defined as the degree to which a resource is susceptible to adverse effects. Vulnerability is comprised of these elements of exposure and sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And there's a wide variety of vulnerability assessments out there, and they may have different terminology, but it's all kind of the same concept. And this particular system is one that you really see common for climate change vulnerability assessments. So we have these elements. So your exposure is your disturbance, the event that's causing some negative impact in your ecosystem or for your resource. So it could be climate changes, it could be flood events, it could be fire. Sensitivity is the response of your resource or ecosystem to that exposure, and that results in your impact, or the potential for loss, it says here, but also the potential change, the potential for undesired outcomes. Adaptive capacity is also an important concept within the vulnerability assessment process, and this is essentially the ability of your system to cope with that impact. It could be something you think of as like ecosystem resilience, how well it bounces back in the face of some disturbance, but it also could be relate to how well management intervention might reduce this impact and therefore reduce vulnerability. And so exposure and sensitivity tend to, increases in those will increase your impact and increase vulnerability. Increased adaptive capacity reduces your vulnerability. So there's this relationship between these two that is important to consider. So why we use vulnerability assessments? Well, this whole concept and design was designed to identify and evaluate how and why something is negatively impacted by disturbances. And vulnerability assessments are particularly useful when you have a lot of complex information, because it's a system for organizing that information in a specific way that helps you prioritize actions and identify opportunities. So you can simply quantify vulnerability for multiple resources and then identify priorities in that way. You could prioritize trying to restore the most vulnerable ecosystem, or you may prioritize the least vulnerable, your best bet option. You also start to, by organizing your information in this framework to identify potential intervention points. Do you want to, is it possible to reduce exposure if that's what's driving vulnerability, or reduce sensitivity, or can you increase adaptive capacity? And so you see vulnerability assessments used a lot in adaptive management planning for a lot of planning efforts, period. You know, this is usually one of those initial steps, and that's because it kind of helps you organize your thoughts. And they also can be quite good when you're dealing with uncertainty, and that uncertainty could be derived from not having complete knowledge, or it could be because of uncertain futures, which is a big thing, of course, when we're trying to project into the future with respect to climate change. Even if you don't have perfect knowledge, you usually can start to explore each of these elements, and that allows you to say something about vulnerability. And so you're able to do something even in absence of perfect knowledge, and that's a really helpful thing when you when you need to make decisions without perfect knowledge, right? So this flexibility, this organizational kind of exercise is really important when we start talking about climate fire ecosystem interactions. And so what you're seeing here is I guess another conceptual diagram of some of the climate factors that relate to fire regime changes and their potential influences on a variety of ecosystem effects. And this was really the result of an early brainstorming between many of the team members here for the Southwest FireCLIME project. And it was a way to organize information and thinking about how we could organize it for the literature synthesis. But as well, this started us on this path to drill down as to what the important indicators of vulnerability would be. So we had to translate this kind of interactive process into that vulnerability assessment framework that I was just showing you. We also had to consider a few other things. We needed the tool to be able to provide information for a wide variety of situations using a variety of data sources. I've already talked about, you know, we can have a lot of variation in the data that's available, but also that chart I just showed you, some of those interactions are going to be stronger in some ecosystems than others. And in some cases, some ecosystems might only be affected by certain interactions. And so we needed this tool to be able to take care of any of those contingencies, to be able to cover that. As part of that, we needed to select indicators of vulnerability, specifically this exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, that were reliable. And so that means that we would be able to find information on these indicators most of the time. You know, there's sometimes very important drivers in fire behavior or something, but if it's something where you would have a difficult time finding information for the majority of ecosystems, it's not going to be a reliable indicator for a tool that you're trying to make be applicable to a wide variety of systems and things like that. So there was kind of this criteria for indicator selection. Also, we had to figure out a way to define the negative in a way that would be consistent but also flexible. And so vulnerability is the susceptibility of something, right? So it's this negative impact. However, that what is negative can vary considerably across different manager units or even from a theoretical perspective. And so we had to figure out a way to have vulnerability to what question answered. Kind of related to that, we recognize that not all change is negative. Just because some fire regime element is going to change in response to climate, that doesn't necessarily mean that that change is bad for your ecosystem or for your management goals. And so there was this dual effect. And again, kind of a need for flexibility to be integrated into this tool. And then finally, related to the overall FireCLIME objectives, the framework needs to incorporate the impacts of management actions. So what we get when we consider all these things is something that looks like this. So here we have your vulnerability, just like in that other graphic I showed you, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And what we created was a simple additive system based on core fire, ecosystem, and fuel indicators. And I'll talk about those on the very next slide. But the additive component means that we have indicators for climate change and for the fire regime response to climate change. And the more of these indicators that are relevant to your ecosystem, the higher the exposure, the higher the impact, and the more vulnerable that system will be. Similarly, with sensitivity, we have intrinsic and response-based indicators. The more of those that you have, the higher this score will be, the higher the vulnerability. And then adaptive capacity also has its indicators, and the more of these that are relevant for your system, the lower the vulnerability will be, right? Because higher adaptive capacity results in lower, it mitigates this a little bit, results in lower vulnerability. So it's a very simple kind of additive system. You know, of course, some of this draws it down, but still, same thing. So secondly, we use desired future conditions that are defined by the user. So it can be as unique as the user wants it to be, but those are used as the baseline. So each of these elements considers, for instance, I'll just go into fire regime change, considers whether or not fire regimes change with respect to climate changes. And then it also considers whether that change is a negative thing with respect to desired future conditions. So does that change represent further departure from desired future conditions? Similarly, with sensitivity, we have some intrinsic characteristics of the ecosystem that may contribute sensitivity, but much of the sensitivity is from the response of various ecosystem and fuels components, and responses that are expected to bring those components further from desired future conditions will contribute to an increased sensitivity and an increased impact. And then for adaptive capacity, we also have a response element where some of these changes may result in a benefit, or the component may go closer to your desired future conditions, and that is accounted for in the adaptive capacity that will reduce vulnerability. And then, of course, we want to include management, so that is also included in the adaptive capacity quantification, where it's an optional module, but you can indicate whether management was able to bring various components closer to your desired future conditions, and where it does, it will reduce the vulnerability score. So that's how that works. And so I think I kind of covered this third point. It's a response-based system that considers change and the nature of that change. Responses can be positive or negative, and depending on whether they are, they will either increase or decrease the vulnerability score. And so here is, we're kind of getting close to the end of the first component. Here's kind of an overview of the whole system. So here we have our exposure, our intrinsic sensitivity and adaptive capacity, and then that management component, what we're calling extrinsic adaptive capacity, things that come from outside. So within each of these boxes, you can see the components that are used in the vulnerability assessment. And again, these were brainstormed on all the different kinds of interactions, and then we got feedback from the workshops on which seemed to be the best measures that might relate to what managers need, and also what we're probably able to find information on. And so for our climate change scenarios, or our variables, we have these 6: fire season length, ERC, drought frequency, duration, average summer temperature, relative humidity, and snowpack. Also, I should mention some of our selection process for these indicators. We tried to select indicators in a way so that we minimize redundancy. And so you may think, oh, there's some other really relevant climate change indicators that should be included in here, but maybe they're covered in one of the variables you already see. And so, and you'll see that too when we talk about, I think, the fire regime characteristics and then the response characteristics. But so our 4 primary fire regime measures, and you'll see these again and again as I go through these slides. These were the 4 that we boiled down as the ones that we were concentrating on for this assessment. So the size of high severity patch, the fire frequency, soil burn severity, and annual area burned. And again, there's other fire regime components that we could have included in here, but some of them could be considered related to some of these, or they could be considered related to some of the ecosystem responses to fire regime change. And so we selected those that we thought were the most relevant, reliable, and minimized redundancy. So these are our 4 fire regime characteristics, and we assess these with respect to climate change scenarios. So the intrinsic sensitivity and adaptive capacity, now we're starting to talk more about our landscape here. And so we have these intrinsic sensitivity characteristics here, and these are things that that probably lend greater likelihood of negative impact to an ecosystem if they're present. So these are primarily yes/no questions. And so, you know, what is your current fire regime with respect to departure from desired conditions, your historic management regime, drought sensitivity, whether your system exists at an ecotone, whether there's invasive plants present, whether your primary vegetation is dispersal limited. And there's definitions for all of these in the tools, so I'm just going to whip through this really fast. Then there's some stuff about fuel or weather limited systems. Is your system projected to experience a decline under future climates, or are there other disturbances affecting it? And so answering yes to any of these would contribute to the sensitivity score. And then we have what's a rather large component of the tool, and that's the response to fire regime change. And this is where you can get those positive or negative responses. So we have 5 ecosystem components and 3 fuel components. And collectively, I tend to refer to these as landscape components, but hopefully I'll be consistent with that. But we have ecosystem and fuels. I'll try to be good with that. So in any case, we have species survivorship, species recruitment, erosion and debris flows, species composition, and stand structure. And then for fuel, we're interested in fuel loading, continuity, and structure. And so the exposure considers the effect of climate change on these 4 fire regime characteristics. And it is possible that these climate changes could result in a positive outcome for those fire regime characteristics. And in that case, your exposure would be 0, right? Exposure is something that's likely to cause a negative impact. And so this tool has built into it the capacity to zero out any potential fire regime changes that aren't going to result in a negative impact. And this is the first place that that can occur. And so that's why we have a multiplication here, because the multiplication helps us zero out, essentially. But for the rest of these, we essentially add up the sensitivity characteristics with the response characteristics, and this will give you a vulnerability score. And then, if you wish, you can go through and for up to 3 treatments, indicate how well a particular treatment has improved conditions in your fuels, in your fire regime, and in your ecosystems. And by going through these modules, you get you'll get treatment effectiveness scores, is what we're calling it right now. And these actually can reduce, or they give you an adjusted vulnerability score. So you can use the original vulnerability score just from all this stuff up here, or you can also go through a treatment run and then get yourself some adjusted vulnerability scores that will help you assess how well each of these treatments were able to reduce vulnerability. So that's our first part. Now I'm going to go and let's see. I am going to get out of this presentation and show you the Excel file. So let me just figure out how to do this. Okay. So what we have here, and actually, are you guys seeing that now? I think I took it on my other side. Do you see that okay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, awesome. So the tool right now is in a macro-enabled Excel file, and it probably will be for the near future as well. And so what it consists of are several tabs down here. We have an instructions tab, we have our pre-work, our tool itself, or the majority of the calculation and information is recorded, and then we have a results tab. And then we also have these notes tabs, and this essentially just records the responses that you've given, and I think it will make it easier to print those out or keep a record of them if you're doing multiple iterations, which is probably, that's certainly the way the case study is working out that we're going to show you today, and probably one of the more useful ways to use this. So it's good to keep track of what you input so you can repeat it later. But anyways, the instruction page, you know, this is just talking about the ways you can use it, how to use it. This is probably in the work still. This is a beta version, I'll say. And then some pointers, and then talking about scoring uncertainty. And I haven't really emphasized this, but uncertainty, quantifying that is a really important aspect of vulnerability assessments. And so with each question that you complete, you're able to score your certainty or your confidence. And then that helps you interpret your results at the end and gives you a feeling for, I guess, how confident you can be in particular results. So if you start in with the pre-work, the first thing that you are asked to do here is to, oh, things are going to come out on the wrong side, is to indicate how those 6 climate variables are going to change. And so you can see the options here are increase, decrease, or no change. Here's your uncertainty. It's already in a high, mod, low. Later on, it's in a 1, 2, 3, and I suppose we'll make that the same, but in either case, you can click this little box and it tells you what we mean by that. But you go ahead and you select your choices, you hit submit, and it writes this to a worksheet that's hidden right now, and that's used to calculate some of the variables. And actually, the climate scenario data does not contribute to a score in and of itself. It's just the thing that you put in here for your own information, so then you can remind yourself when you're talking about fire regime change and all that stuff. So we're going to close this. The second thing is the landscape module. Let me bring this back over. And again, this doesn't contribute to the score, but this is a really important pre-work because the entire tool is based on desired future conditions. This is the place where you really outline it in your own mind and in your notes what those desired future conditions are. And so, you can name, especially important, name your ecosystem and maybe the iteration you're doing if you're doing multiple. What's your historic fire regime? What's the historic management regime? And then we ask a few things about your desired future conditions. First of all, what are they based on? Reference conditions or climate adapted landscape, etc. Then we ask, what are your desired future conditions for the fire regime itself, or say fire frequency and high severity patch size. And then we ask, what are your desired future conditions for your ecosystem in terms of the various components that are used in here? And again, this is just really important for your own sake so that you're being consistent when you're answering the questions, and it just makes the process a lot easier. And then geographic features that might be relevant. And then this final one, what is the time point of this assessment? And I think that, personally, I think that's really important because you can consider some things like fire frequency that will have some impact in the next 10 years if it changes and increases, and its impact in the next 50 or 100 years might be quite different. So you have to keep in mind what your time is. And so that's kind of the purpose. So important pre-work. And then finally, here is the module where you record, and I've just put in, this is totally made up stuff, so don't read into it too much. But this is just, again, for the user's help, or I guess exercise for the user to get in their mind exactly what they want to compare. And then, of course, it's good for notes later too. But what kind of treatment are you talking about? What's the seasonality? What's the annual area? Percent of total area, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it doesn't contribute to the score, but it's really important note taking. And I guess I could say too, for those of you that we're talking about doing a case study with you all in Lincoln, that's the kind of information that we're really going to need from you. That's the critical component. And then once we've outlined those, the rest of it is quite easy because you just reference that context. So here's the actual kind of busy sheet with most of the tool stuff. We have 4 sections here, so probably shouldn't highlight that. So we have the first section, fire regime response, and so it has 3 different tables, and you can select various responses. And I'll come back to this. I just want to show us the whole sheet here. The second section regards ecosystem and fuel responses. This table actually includes all those intrinsic characteristics I talked about, like invasive species and drought sensitivity and things like that. That's where that information is filled in, and you put your confidence scores in here, and it is I have it as a numbering system now, but I guess we might change that to be consistent with the others. But it's the same thing. The higher the score, the more confident. At the bottom of section 2, we have this response score module, and so there's for the ecosystem and fuels. Then we have the optional treatments module. So again, it is totally optional, and you don't have to do all 3 treatments. You could just look at 1 treatment. You'll get a score from, at the completion of section 2, you get a score that can be used for things. And then anything you do down here will modify that score as a second thing. And then the final thing, popping up, okay, is section 4, a weighting scheme. This is also optional. And so here we have our 4 fire regime components, our 5 ecosystem components, and our fuel components. And the purpose of this is to allow the user to change the relative influence of a component within its category. And so there might be a number of reasons why you might want to do this. For instance, I think we've outlined 3. One being, if you believe climate may have a stronger influence on some component than others, you might want to give it a higher rank, essentially giving it more weight in the final outcome. So whatever happens to that component that you've ranked more highly will have more influence on the vulnerability score. A second reason why you might want to rank things differently and identify elements that you want to weight more is that they relate more to your desired future conditions. They're a more important component, or they drive, ecosystem function in some way. And so you really want to emphasize that component. And a third one might be your management objectives. Maybe you're only focused on, addressing stand structure, species composition. And in that case, you would want to emphasize these. And so they're all given a 1 right now, which means they're equally weighted. And if you wanted to change the rank, you just simply, I have some examples over here, you change it 1, 2, 3, 4. If you think that, they're sequentially important. If you think that 1 is particularly important, you would give that a score of 1, and the remaining would get a score of 2. Sorry, I keep getting that pop-up. I don't know if you're seeing that. Maybe you think that there's 2 that are more important than the others, or that there's 1 that's really not important, and then you can give it a lower ranking. And you can do these any way you want. You just can't skip a number. So, you have to go 1, 2, 3. You can't go 1, 3. So that's that. So anyways, let's look at this in a little bit more detail now. So fire regime response. We have 3 tables. The first table essentially is asking you, what is the current status of your fire regime components? So here we have those 4 components: high severity patch size, fire frequency, soil burn severity, annual area burn. And you indicate whether it's departed or within range with respect to your, current desired conditions. And this table actually contributes to the sensitivity score. It's incorporated into that score. It's included in this section because it just makes sense to talk about the fire regimes all at the same time. So. But whether or not it's departed is an indication in part in how sensitive your system may be, right? So tables 1.2 and 1.3 really regard the exposure. And so first we ask, how do you expect that changes in climate, which are over here on the right-hand side, will affect your fire regime components? So you could say increase, decrease, or no change. You can give some level of confidence there. For this little quick fill-in that I did, I just said, oh, they're all going to increase. This isn't necessarily a real example. So if you see something that's striking you as wrong, keep that in mind. And then finally, table 3, this is really where we're getting at. Is this an exposure issue or not? We ask, okay, given that change in this upper box, does this bring you closer or further to your desired future conditions? And so you can be further, closer, or no change. And notice I put for fire frequency, I said it's actually going to move closer to desired conditions. And you'll see how that reflects in the final results as an example. I just wanted to give you that as an example. So then once you've done that, it's pretty quick and easy, I think. You go on to the ecosystem and fuel response. You indicate which of these are relevant, simple yes or no boxes, confidence. For your system, this will contribute to sensitivity scores. And then we get into our first modules, and they look something like this. And so I already have these filled out. I'm going to leave them. but I hope that, I don't know how wide your guys' screens are, but we'll hope that you're seeing this whole thing. Anyways, for your convenience, we have the 4 fire regimes and how we expect those to move with respect to desired future conditions. And then we have this series of questions that ask how do each of those fire regimes affect the components with respect to your desired future conditions. So how will the change in the high severity patch size affect species survivorship? And so for here we have further, and we felt moderately confident that that was to be. And then similarly for species recruitment, erosion, composition, sand structure, and then for each of the fire elements. And so then again, you hit submit, that writes to a worksheet and contributes to the calculations. And then we have a similar thing for fuels. Again, you have your fire categories up here, or your responses, excuse me, and then you consider for each of those fire regime components how each of the fuel components will respond. And so I filled in some things rather quickly. And at that point, there has been a vulnerability score generated and scores generated for each of the components with respect to expected impacts. And so you can just stop there, or you can go on to the treatments, which we're going to go through right now just to help you visualize. So the treatment windows kind of look the same. Here are our treatments 1, 2, and 3. And this is for the fuels. We start with the fuels because it seemed to be most informative later on for what you might see on fire regime response and then ecosystem response. So with respect to the treatments, we give you a range of values that you can select from. And it's important to note that we only consider potential positive effects of treatments. And presumably your treatments are not going to have negative impacts, but if they did, you could leave that particular element blank, and at least it won't be counted as a positive effect. But essentially, it's just it gets a little too convoluted to start considering positives and negatives on the treatments. And so we're just going to assume that the treatments either don't have an effect or they have some capacity to improve. So the more that they're able to improve, the higher, the more you move towards excellent, the higher the treatment score will be. And the treatment score is subtracted out of the impact score. So the better the treatment is at bringing your fuel component towards your desired future conditions according to you and what you put in here, the lower that impact score, and ultimately the lower the vulnerability score. And I'll show you the graphics for that, but that's kind of how it works. So then we have a similar thing for your let's see, where was it? The ecosystem components here. There's a few more categories. And then, or no, that was the fire regime response. No wonder I wasn't reading that right. And then here's the ecosystem components. So the same kind of structure in all of these. Okay. And then we've already talked about the weighting scheme. So let me go on to the results. So this is the way the results page looks right now. It starts off with kind of this beginning summary section. Here's the name of your area and what you said about some of your conditions. And so this hopefully would make it easy to print off or something like that. But also, what did you say about your climate change components and your fuels? This is all just been translated. And this is available in the notes pages as well. And then here's our first summary of confidence scores for the current fire regime future, and departure. And so, just from my random application of this tool, we would say it looks like I was more confident in the status of the current fire regimes than necessarily how it's going in the future, the higher, or I guess I was less confident, excuse me. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so, and here's a reminder, we were looking at 2050 for this example. The second section are our results. And so here we have our overall vulnerability, you have exposure, your intrinsic sensitivity, average response score, average impact. And so overall vulnerability of 5.3 on a scale. It can go from -10 to +10. So it's definitely vulnerable, right? And it's fairly high, I would say, too, given that range. And so I don't really want to say much about these right now just because this is a made-up example, but maybe we could say more about the case study example I'll show you in a minute. So the second table is giving the individual impact scores for each of those ecosystem and fuel components, and that kind of corresponds, well, that does correspond to the first two charts. So this is the ecosystem components and the fuel components. And so the higher the score here, and these are the impact scores, the higher the score, the greater the impact. And negative scores result from a lot of expected positive responses in those modules I showed you. So if you have something like here we have fuel continuity that is expected to move closer to desired future conditions in response to fire regime change, it will actually accumulate a lot of negative scores that draw down the vulnerability, right? And you'll see it as a negative. So hopefully that makes sense. But more higher scores is higher impact, higher vulnerability, all that good stuff. Negative scores indicate some resilience or benefit. And so if we look at this, it looks like recruitment is given the changes that we expect in the fire regime in this particular iteration, recruitment is least likely to be impacted negatively. Similar impacts for these variables. With respect to the fuel components, we see fuel loading is expected to have the greatest negative impact, likely to have some positive impact for fuel continuity, and fuel structure is small, but kind of positive impact. And then finally, the final table are the scores for individual fire components, and that's what you're seeing in Table 3. And then Table 4 is showing you for each of those fire regime components how each ecosystem component scores. So it'll either be it's going to be impacted or it's going to be of benefit, right? So all of these are likely to be impacted negatively by the size of the high severity patch. You'll notice for both of these, and I guess the table as well, that fire frequency is 0. And that's because we said it is moving closer to our desired future conditions. And so in the theory of vulnerability assessments, there's no exposure to a negative fire regime impact for this particular component. So you see that it's 0 here and it's 0 here. And so that's how that works. If that's something, and I don't know how common that'll be, if that's something that actually is relevant to your ecosystem. If we look at soil burn severity, you can see, again, the majority of the landscape components here show a potential negative impact, and it's a little bit different from what we see in the first. And then if we look at annual area burn, we can see that field continuity is expected to improve due to that. And, you know, we're seeing that up there as well. Here you have your confidence scores. These can help tell you how much you may want to rely on these individual scores. You know, here are field treatments. Well, this is for the intrinsic sensitivity, but if we go to the fire ecosystem response, and then this is for the fire regime components. But we can see our confidence is pretty high for a lot of those ecosystem components, with the exception of composition and structure. So if you're looking at some of these, maybe you would say, okay, it's saying we're having a great impact, but our confidence wasn't that great there, so that may be something that we won't rely on heavily in our decision-making processes. Okay, and then finally, we're going to look at the output for the management scenario. So here, table 3.1, our original score without vulnerability, and then our scores under treatment 1, 2, and 3. So treatment 1 was able to bring that score all the way down to neutral, essentially. Treatment 2 was able to push that even into a negative value, so it had the greatest decline in vulnerability. And then treatment 3 was somewhere in between. And so we have these graphs that kind of show us the percent improvement. And so we can see for the landscape component, treatment 3 seems to have treatment 2 seems to have a slightly better capacity to reduce the impact scores of the various landscape components. If we look at it for overall fire regime, we can see treatment 1 and 3 seem to be slightly better than treatment 2. And then these are probably a little bit easier to interpret, but these are our change in vulnerability scores for the ecosystem and fuel components, and then for the fire regime. And so, again, this is kind of my quick made-up version, but the triangles represent the original impact score for each of these components, and then each of the treatments is a different shape here. And from this particular outcome, you can see that really the treatments are really clustered here. There's no real winner as far as the made-up ones that I did. There, you could maybe start to see for, well, fuel continuity and structure, treatment 2 seems to have a slightly better capacity to reduce impact than the others. And maybe the same can be said for survivorship and recruitment. If we look at the regime components, again, they're kind of clustered, but you do get a more of a clear signal here that treatment 3 seems to be improving soil burn severity and annual area burned with respect to the desired conditions that were outlined. And so if your management goal is to really focus on these, this would be some indication that treatment 3 might be the most appropriate treatment to pursue to reduce those impacts. And then here we have some confidence scores, and I think I've already talked about that. So I'm going to reduce this and go back to the presentation. And let me see. Okay. Okay, so I don't know. I could take a pause here and take questions, or I could just move on through with the case study. How do people feel? Should I just keep going? Okay, I'm just going to keep going. How about that? So, okay, this is, and actually, I guess this is good to put up here too. This is kind of an overview of what you've just seen from the vulnerability assessment tool. So we have our outputs. We have impact scores for fire regime components, for ecosystem components, for fuel components. We have uncertainty or confidence scores for all the individual responses, and then they're presented as summaries. And then we have vulnerability and impact scores before and after treatment. And so these various outputs can be used to identify climate-driven changes in individual fire regime components, link fire regime shifts to ecosystem impacts, incorporate climate uncertainties by, ranking it as less confident, compare across ecosystem treatments, and prioritize areas of concern. And so kind of a different way to look at this is this nice little diagram that Rachel helped out when we were trying to describe this earlier. And this shows you some of the types of comparisons. Again, I think this tool's strength is in running multiple iterations under multiple scenarios so that you can compare how those vulnerability and impact scores change. And that really will help identify what treatments or under what conditions you see the most dramatic changes, and that just helps identify potential areas needing attention or opportunities if it's something positive. So in this first box, we show 2 different vegetation types. You can explore them under the same climate scenario and same treatment, and essentially compare the vulnerability of the vegetation to your expected changes in climate fire dynamics. You can compare a single vegetation type under a couple different climate scenarios and look at a treatment to assess whether that treatment maybe is as effective under both those scenarios or not. You can also explore down here. Oops, I'm not actually, I forgot my little pointer. Sorry, guys. I'm down here now. You can explore how maybe more than one treatment can influence the response of a vegetation type to under very climate scenario. And so is there differences in effectiveness? That's kind of what I was talking about, I think, in the demo. And then you can mix it all up, of course, and you can look at a vegetation type under different climate scenarios and under different treatment scenarios to try to infer something about what kind of treatment might be most effective under what kind of future. And so it can help you explore all of these. Oops, now I can't get my, can't get my tool out of this window. Well, let's see if we can just move. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the case study. And I don't know if I emphasized this very much in the beginning, but again, this tool is meant to be really flexible with respect to data inputs. And so that not only does that mean like the quantity of data, but the type of data. And so for some ecosystems, you might have a lot of information from modeling exercises and various research studies. For other systems, you might more have expertise in the management community or with experts. And so you should be able to use both types of information in this with this tool. The first round of case studies that we're doing, we are trying to assess how well we can assess things about vulnerability from literature. And so Stephanie Mueller has been working a lot, doing a lot of iterations and reading a lot of papers to complete vulnerability assessments for ponderosa pine and mixed conifer ecosystems in the Jemez Mountains. And this corresponds to ecosystems that were part of the modeling exercises too that I talked about at the very beginning. And so it provides us a way of kind of really gauging how this is working. So we chose a warm, dry future trajectory to outline our climate in that pre-work tab. We also used the 2015 final environmental impact statement for the Southwest Jemez Mountains Landscape Restoration Project to outline our treatment inputs, as well as I think the desired future conditions. But if I'm wrong on that, Stephanie can correct me. And then we were looking at a 2050 time period. That was our desired time period. And so what you're seeing here is kind of is a schematic of the iterations that we're doing for this exercise. So here's ponderosa pine, and Stephanie made this nice slide, so I don't want to take credit for everybody else's slides here. But ponderosa pine, mixed conifer, we have 2 climate scenarios, and then for each of those climate scenarios, we have 3 types of treatments. And then we also went through and ran each of these under various weighting schemes. And the weighting schemes I'll talk about more in a minute, but corresponding to what I described earlier, where climate change may have an impact, where desired conditions may influence what we're interested in, where management goals may influence what we're interested in. Now, I'm going to talk about ponderosa pine and the RCP 4.5 scenario today. Really, when we look at this more extreme scenario, and that's what it is, hopefully everybody's kind of familiar with this stuff. I didn't plan on talking about it. But when we look at this more extreme scenario, essentially you get a greater degree of warming. And so at the end of the century, year 2100, things are hotter. And I guess you also get a more rapid rate of temperature increase, but really it's not entirely different for year 2050. And so we're probably not going to pursue running our case studies under this separate scenario because there's not a whole lot of difference by mid-century in these scenarios, and especially given that this tool is asking you to say things like, oh, we're further or closer to desired conditions. That's a fairly, broad statement, and so I don't know that it's very useful to try to assess the fine differences between, a degree, half a degree change. We just feel like it may not be a great exercise. So we have this nice diagram of our plan, and maybe it would be relevant for other systems or time periods. But for the most part, we're doing our case studies on the RCP 4.5. So now for a few examples. So here are treatment variations that I talked about, duration of the treatments here. Work will be done over 8 to 10 years or until objectives are met. Our desired outcome date is 2050. And again, these were taken from the EIS, and so we have treatment 1, which I think is really an ideal, mechanically treat a good number of acres of ponderosa pine. Use prescribed fire on a large number of acres to reduce post-thin flash, and additional prescribed fire in non-treated areas. Treatment 2 is a no prescription fire alternative designed to, I think, with consideration of the health impacts of having prescribed fires and the smoke and stuff. So essentially, mechanically treating and masticating the same number of acres is treated here, and reducing prescribed fire in other areas as well. And in treatment 3, a no action alternative. So no change to current management, which includes some mechanical thinning and some prescribed fire, but somewhat smaller scale than these first 2 treatments. So jumping right to the results of this, here we have again, our triangles for our original impact scores for all of these. And here you can see in Stephanie's examples, we're getting a little bit more spread in those various treatments. And specifically, you can see treatment 1 seems to really help reduce those scores the most. And so it seems to be the most effective with respect to these ecosystem and fuel components, pretty much across the board. If we look at our fire regime components, here we can see somewhat of a different pattern. If we're looking at size of high severity patch or soil burn severity, we see treatment 2 seems to be much more effective. It's reducing those scores the most, whereas treatment 1, again, seems to be the most effective with respect to fire frequency and annual area burned. And so this kind of information can be really informative when you are assessing the feasibility of different treatments, because if you're more concerned with, say, reducing soil burn severity or the size of high severity patches, this is an indication that treatment 2 would be a better avenue to pursue. If instead you're more concerned with fire frequency or annual area of burn, then treatment 1 is definitely looking better. And treatment 1 obviously has these added benefits. And of course, then you would also need to consider costs and other aspects of feasibility. But this at least helps you identify some of the ways in which the climate-fire interactions can be influenced by your treatment. So, all right, and then I'm just going to show you one last thing with respect to the weights. And so what you see here are 3 columns corresponding to 3 different weightings of the data. And we don't have right now the weights by treatment. So I'm just going to show you these results for, I think, the first, I don't remember which treatment, maybe it's untreated. But in any case, so here we have, remember that if all of these are being considered or are all equally weighted, they will all be given a score of 1. If you think something is less important, then you give it a lower score, or I guess, higher number. So 1 is most important, 2 is second most important, and on and on. So this first column represents the assumption that some characteristics will be more strongly influenced by climate changes and fire regime changes in some cases than others. And so though there is certainly some likelihood that climate will impact some of these fire regime changes, by the time period that we're talking about, it kind of is all a wash. So Stephanie's not changed the rankings on these. These are just as if it's unweighted. For our 5 ecosystem components, and there's all this description here, but I don't want to go into it necessarily. Stephanie included species recruitment and erosion and debris flows as the most important, and then these other 3 as less important. It's not that they're not important, but if we're going to talk about climate impacts and fire regime impacts, these are the 2 that are likely to be most influenced, and so we wanted to weight those responses. And then with respect to fuels, fuel continuity was considered the most important and fuel loading the least. If we look at the second assumption that might change our weights, that certain characteristics have a stronger influence on desired future conditions, we see here that the fire regime elements have been ranked differently, with high severity patch size being the most important, soil burn severity second, and then fire frequency, annual area burn somewhat lesser important. With respect to ecosystems, the erosion and debris flows and stand structure were most important for having a strong influence, perhaps on the desired future conditions. And then fuel loading and fuel structure were considered more important here than fuel continuity. And then if we think about management focus and that it may have certain priorities in a plan or whatnot, here again, I guess it's a little bit different. High severity patch and soil burn severity were considered most important or given the highest ranking, and so those responses will have more of an influence on vulnerability. Stand structure was the single most important variable, so it's going to be given the greatest weight and have the most influence on the final vulnerability score, and then within this category. And then fuel loading was considered the most important amongst the fuel characteristics. So here's our overall vulnerability scores with no weights, with climate change considerations, with desired future condition, and management. And so you don't see much change with the climate change responses. If you recall, the fire regime components themselves were kind of considered equal, and there wasn't a whole lot of breakdown, or we had mostly ones and twos, I think, in the rest of the categories. So there wasn't much change. Net is about the same. However, if you start to concentrate on those elements that you think relate most closely to your desired future conditions or your management goals, the vulnerability score actually is higher. And that's because those elements that were considered most important or most relevant, I guess, for this particular study were actually expected to have a negative response to fire regime change. And so that drove this vulnerability score up. If those characteristics were actually expected to have a positive response, we would have seen this score go down. And so there's a lot more ways to look at this, but I know this presentation is getting kind of long, so I didn't want to go into everything, but we have a couple more slides just to show you. Here's the no-wait, climate change, DFC, management scenarios. This is the ecosystem components and the fuel components. And so we can see under those different weighting schemes, and let me get it out so I can remind myself what was what, but you can see that it's just changing the relative proportion of each of these indicators. It's not, necessarily changing anything overall, and in part that's because these are all positive scores. So the vulnerability score did change, but that's more because of what's going on in the fuel components than the ecosystem components, because these are all positive, and it changed the relative weight of those contributing to that positive score, but it didn't draw it down necessarily because there was no benefits expected. And so, for instance, you can see that erosion and debris flow, it's definitely the most vulnerable, or having the greatest impact, I should say, across the board. But in this final scenario where we said management, or excuse me, where we said stand structure is the most relevant variable for our management goals, you can see that that definitely has been bumped up. It's having more influence on that overall score, and the erosion a little bit less influence. It was given a lower rank. So it doesn't necessarily totally change the pattern, but it will change what the influence was. And that becomes important if you do have a situation like this where you have some potential benefits. And so the no wait, and here you can see the climate change a little bit better, but so in the no wait, we have fuel loading and fuel structure expected to have a negative impact, and fuel continuity likely to benefit. In the management scenario, the fuel continuity is given the lowest rank, and so it's less important. And so you can see that negative value, which would draw down the vulnerability score, is far less for this component, and that drives the vulnerability up. And so that's why we see that. And so this, I think, is my final slide, just showing this in a different way. So here's impact scores for all of those different ecosystem and fuel components, the no wait, climate change, etc. And I've just shown the relative influence of these scores under those different weighting schemes. And so the highest scores here, of course, are going to draw or increase the vulnerability of the most. The negative scores will draw down the vulnerability, and having lower scores will, of course, too. But you can see the weighting didn't really change the general pattern that erosion and debris flows are the most heavily impacted, but it did change the distribution, I guess, for the other variables a bit, where survivorship and recruitment become much less important for contributing to the score, and composition and structure become more important. And then you can see again that fuel continuity, because it was weighted much less, it's contributing less of a negative score, so less of a drawdown. So hopefully that's all made sense. Okay, and then this is the last slide I have officially. I do have a couple other slides if we want to talk about data inputs and stuff, and that's mainly for the case study folks, but I think for the most part, this is a good place to be, kind of the outputs that you get from this and what you can use those outputs for. Okay. And so is there anybody on the phone still? I really feel blind.
Still here.
Okay. So are there any questions? Okay, here, I'm exiting this so I can actually see what's going on. And should I stop sharing? What do we all think?
You can, why don't you keep sharing, Megan, in case you want to
Oh.
refer to the slide or anything, if people have questions.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's pretty easy, actually.
So this is Xander. I'll kind of kick things off and give other folks a chance to think for a second. I don't have a specific question, but I just wanted to say, having seen some previous iterations of the tool, it's really awesome to see how it's come together. And, you know, ideas that someone chipped out during previous calls, like, oh, we should do graphics, or, you know, you should highlight this. You did it all. So great job. You know, I think it's, admittedly, it's a really fairly complex tool, but it's a complex question. And so I think you've done a nice job in giving us paths through the complexity. Yeah, so anyway, I just wanted to chip that out. But hopefully other people have more specific questions.
Well, thank you. That's very, very nice. And it is important to hear that it resembles something that you were envisioning. So hopefully, at least, or reflects your input. So I appreciate everybody's input.
Well, so I assume that the silence means that people are still gathering themselves. Can you hear me?
I can.
This is Robert Zeal. And I was interested in knowing, I realize that this is evaluating things over decades. Is there sensitivity to seasonal variations and sort of spatial variations? Those kinds of questions strike me.
So, okay, it depends. You could do that by identifying, and if I'm understanding what you're saying right. So, first of all, you can identify, you mean sensitivity of the ecosystems to seasonal changes in fire regime components, or the seasonality of your treatments, or maybe I do need a little bit more.
Yeah, so for example, let's say we think that our fires will burn more acres in the spring than during the peak season. Is that accessible in here?
Yeah, I would say it is, because you can identify how these changes will be. So if you think what we did, okay, so let's say you think that they'll burn more in the spring, that would be one of the assumptions that you would bring into that pre-work. And then as you're going through and saying, okay, is this increase in fire frequency and in the spring going to negatively impact these ecosystem or fuel components? You know, so it'd be kind of integrated, because that's something you would define at the beginning. If you're not so sure about that and you want to see whether if the increased frequency in the spring would be worse, increased vulnerability more, let's say, than increased fire frequency in the fall, you could run 2 iterations. One, assuming increased fire frequency in the spring, and you answer all the questions with respect to that. And then a second with the increase in the fall. And then you would be able to compare vulnerability and identify which components, you know, seem to be worse off, and things like that. So I think you can, if I'm understanding that right.
And the other part of it is the sort of spatial question. You know, I assume that you just sort of scale it or scope it within the areas of interest, and there might be multiple areas of interest in Alaska,
Oh,
for
yeah.
example.
Okay, yeah, and that's a really good question. So in the treatment module, we ask, so this is a tool essentially designed to assess landscape level changes. And so maybe if I go to the tool and I can go there, let me see if we go to the management. I want to erase all this stuff, but in any case, here, some of these questions about your treatments, and again, this could be in your landscape as well, and it might be in the landscape one. Ask about, for you to visualize, what are your goals when you're describing your ideal future conditions? What are the goals with respect to percent treated or percent of acres or that landscape scale component? So you make the context, and then you run the tool within that context, you know, so that you can define something. So if you have more than one context, you would run the tool more than once. I don't know if I'm explaining that, you know, and somebody else that's been involved might also be able to explain this better, but it is meant to work at a landscape scale, but many of our implementations are at a smaller scale. And so some of the questions like, what is your treatment strategy, a single large or multiple smaller applications, maybe that would also be relevant for if you have multiple areas of interest within your landscape. Or you could just focus within one area of interest and then run a separate vulnerability assessment for the second area and see if things are the same or different. So that's how it would work in this particular system. It's really a user-defined thing, and that context is really important for interpreting your vulnerability too. You really have to outline that so that your answers are meaningful to your situation. Hopefully that's helpful.
Hey Megan, this is Will with a question. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'm just wondering. So far, the result that you showed us from the HEMES, that was Stephanie filling out the tool based on literature. But I'm wondering, and then you have not yet worked with the staff on the Lincoln to fill it out yet?
No, I haven't. And so I think some of those folks are on the call today. And so we are planning on having a powwow with the group and actually going through the tool. And I have various tables on the kind of information we need. And actually, this might be a better table. You know, and some information like the climate change outputs and the some of the responses are likely to be informed by the literature, but maybe by the managers as well, or whoever's there. But we do need input from the managers for a kind of live thing, and I think we'll probably talk with Craig and all you guys about that during that meeting. But you know, the historic kind of conditions and the current status, and then really outlining those desired future conditions, because again, that'll be important for what we're talking about. Vulnerability to what? You know, that's the big question. So we haven't gone through that, but this webinar is the kind of introduction for everybody, I hope. And then we will, I think, on a fairly long conference call, be going through and seeing what we can fill out here, in particular those treatments and the desired future conditions from the manager input, so that when we actually assess vulnerability, it's with respect to those treatments and those desired conditions.
Okay, and how many staff are you thinking will be on that call? Do you know? And also, what different types of staff, like a range from ecologists to fuels specialists? Do you have an idea on that?
Well, if Craig's on the phone, he introduced a bunch of the folks, but Craig, are you here? And can you answer that? He's been coordinating the effort. He is the main guy rounding up participants, and so as long as they haven't been scared off by all this talk. But Craig, are you there? He might have. I don't know if he left, but I thought he had a whole group. In any case, I can't speak specifically, even though we've had a couple calls now. But I think it's people that are working on the forest. Is there an ecologist in there? I think there's going to be a biologist. You know, Will, I probably should not guess because I could be.
Yeah, we could discuss further.
Yeah. And so, but it's a range of people that work in the Lincoln, and so, and for the Forest Service. And so I would imagine I think he's gotten together. He had a pretty good group earlier today. So they must have nodded off at the hour, because I see we're well into the hour.
Okay, I think we're here now.
Oh,
Can you hear
awesome. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, somehow we got muted. Yeah, so while sitting here, we're a little bit in shock, trying to absorb it all. I've been pretty much the only one exposed to the assessment before. So, so we have Wes here. He's the fire management specialist for the Lincoln. We have David Baker. He's the forest ecologist. Reese Bowen, she's a silviculturalist who worked on the Perk Grindstone project. We have Jasper here. Currently, she's a NEPA coordinator for the Sacramento district, but her background is in plants and invasive species. All right, so close enough. We have Pete Harridan. He's the soil scientist for the Lincoln.
Hydrologist.
Oh yeah, hydrologist. I'm sorry. I get kind of muddied up on that. The next person, the soils person, and that's Jen Hickman.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if anybody else is on the call for the Lincoln. This is everybody at the SO. We gathered here in the big conference room. So I guess my question is, we'll be looking at a site-specific project, kind of like an after-action review on an area that we've treated that's mixed conifer, ponderosa pine, and woodland that we've done various treatments to, prescribed burning, mechanical treatment, a timber harvest. And so we're going to use that as kind of a way to use it as kind of an after-action review and maybe the impacts we've had on potential climate impacts. So it's about, I think it's about 2,500 acres. Is that right, Reese? Yeah. So that's kind of where we're at. And I think we'll also have another fuels person involved too, some of the people that were actually on the ground in the project.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, and I want to mention too, just so we're hoping to get information from the group on desired future condition and treatments, but there's actually this monitoring data that they have conducted that we can use to help answer those response questions for the treatment. So that's kind of an exciting element, because when you do literature-based, it's much more kind of, well, it looks like this is working. So we really look forward to using this on kind of hard, monitor-based information and hopefully provide some interesting information about the treatment.
Yeah, so we have all that. To do it all in a 3-hour workshop, I think it's going to be mostly anecdotal, but we'll have that on hand, and
Okay. Yeah.
people can look at it ahead of time. It might be nice to do some geospatial modeling too, maybe run a potential fire through the project after the fact. And
Yeah.
I don't know if we have time to do that or not.
Well, I think too, when we really get into the conversation, there's going to be perhaps many avenues that will be kind of interesting to explore. So we'll have to see. We'll play it by ear, I guess, as we go. But yeah, I think it's going to be really exciting, and we'll try to get that scheduled, you know, sometime, I don't know, September, October. I think that's what we talked about. So, and then if you guys also want to break it up more, we could do that. Maybe Stephanie and I can talk with you and kind of get the basic coverage, and then, you know, try to maybe run it or do something and come back to you, and then we can refine it. So we'll, you know, we're definitely both doing this for, you know, your group and us here for the first time. So we'll have to give ourselves a little leeway for learning as we go. But I think it should work quite well. I think it's doable, even in an anecdotal sense. It might have a lot of outcomes. So I'm excited for your participation.
So were you thinking that we would try a couple different climate scenarios? And then
well, that's up to you guys. What maybe, and I think, what do you, when you're planning and making plans, what do you have to consider? That's where I would default. Like, what are you thinking about when you have to incorporate climate change? Are you using a particular scenario? Is it kind of more of a general vision? And I would say let's go with that. And we do need to talk about, it sounds like you have three ecosystems, and then I thought it was 3 treatments, but it may have been more. You sent that nice map. So we'll start to make our diagram of the iterations, and keeping in mind that, you know, time may limit the maximum number of iterations, but we can talk about that, and maybe just depending on what you all want to see, let's make this useful and the outcome useful for you. So I think what you're having to use now in your other operations would be good to use here.
Okay.
And maybe I'll send you a follow-up email with a kind of a primer of, okay, this is the kind of information, and these are questions that we have, and just to help jumpstart that a little bit and give you time to think about it too.
Okay. I'd like to hear from some of the others here too, to see what they think. Well, some of them are this is pretty much the first exposure to the tool.
So this is Jen from the soils part. So I guess I'm kind of curious as to the data that you would need from like a soil component, and that you'll get, I guess you'll speak to us individually about how that data should come across, right? I mean, or so that we can help with those inputs. Is there like some guidance that you have for the project that went on in Jemez?
Well, I think, okay, if we focus on the soil component, so right now we talk about erosion and debris flows. I'm going to open this up so I can not misquote myself. Let me go. So what we need to do still as part of the development of this tool is, and we've started this, is to define what we mean by each of these things. And I think that that's going to be important maybe to start off here too. And I do have a list of definitions, but they're kind of by the book. But erosion and debris flows, when we're talking about desired future conditions, I guess it could be to reduce the risk of them, period, or to reduce them in certain areas. You know, it'll kind of depend on maybe what the goals are. And I think, and maybe, I don't know if this is, Stephanie has been envisioning a lot of this and filling it out, but I imagine that when she's thinking closer or further, it's kind of about the frequency or the likelihood of that occurring. And so as far as what we need for that, yeah, it's a little hard for me to envision right, like on the spot right now, because it would just be good to talk about once we get into that discussion about what are the desired future conditions, maybe that will be the place where we say, okay, this is what we're going to mean by this, and then we're going to keep consistent with that through the thing. So I can get back to you on that. I don't think I'm prepared right now, and I apologize, to have like a really good good feel for that. But I think it won't be hard to do. We just need to have a communication about what we want to focus on within that kind of broad category, I think.
Okay, yeah, I just didn't know if it was like a single rating for like an erosion hazard rating for a certain soil type, or if it was like the different soil properties, and you know, if you were looking for like rock and percent rock, or you know, the vegetative cover. I was just kind of curious as to what the inputs were for.
Yeah, you know, I think that we could use any of that. I think, okay, we're going to say this is the goal, our desired future condition, and if it relates to percent plant cover and stabilization, or to, I mean, the erosion risk, you know, that's the, if I'm recalling rightly, that's going to be really based on things that we can't necessarily change through management. So we have to just consider, I mean, you know, it's like the innate characteristics of the soil, and, you know, percent rock and stuff. So perhaps we would be thinking maybe actually the way it'll come out in the real world, quote unquote, situation is that the soil erosion component isn't something that we can change from management. I don't know. So we'll have to talk more. It could be a variety of things that you use to gauge success, and so we'll have to determine that. But you're bringing up some good points.
Okay, thank you.
So this is Robert Zeal again. Can you hear me still?
Yeah.
So I'd like to explore the climate inputs a little bit. I'm wondering, are they mostly year-to-year kinds of changes or trends that you're making inputs for, or if, for example, in the ERC, the trend is a year-to-year trend, or is it a seasonal trend? How is that represented in the model?
Yeah, so this time point is that's been a stickler for a lot of this. So I guess when I have been going through it, and I'm not a fire ecologist, and I haven't necessarily, I've been listening to the team members that are more involved in this. I kind of think of it as the average change in a year-to-year basis, but you could consider it differently. And we had as well additional climate variables that were dropped because it did get complicated, like seasonality of the fire, and moreover, it's difficult in some of these interactions. It's difficult to put a directional change, like a negative versus positive change. And one of the limitations maybe of a vulnerability assessment is we really need to have that direction. You know, you need to have some kind of somewhat finite. It can change over time or whatnot, but it can't be too wishy-washy. Otherwise your vulnerability assessment won't really give you very much. So I would say, again, this will be user defined. You can say, I mean, I guess in your notes, which we do have capacity to take notes, you could say that you're considering something for a particular time point or on an annual overall basis. I don't know. I don't know if anybody else that's been part of those discussions has a better answer, but from my perspective, I just think it's, again, a user-defined thing. And if you define it within, let's say you're talking about early season or late season, and you run the assessment, then the assessment results will pertain to the early and the later season. And so it's just through multiple iterations that you can start to see something. different if you're talking within a year. And so I could see that as working. I was just kind of thinking of this as kind of a big picture annual thing, but I can definitely see why you would want to maybe break it down. And I think that's possible.
Yeah, I was, you know, wondering whether or not there was some underlying place where the ERC trend is actually embedded and utilized in some more specific way.
No, it is not at this time, but maybe that's something to consider for future development, or if we're making a, a different type of application, or even an add-on. Or so I'm recording this, and we can definitely bring it up with the group and see what people think. But right now, what you see is what you get. That's where we are.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Megan.
Yes.
This is Rachel. Can you hear me?
Oh, I can, and everybody else too, to let you know.
Good.
Yeah.
No, I thought so. I was, yeah. So I just didn't want to say everybody else.
Yeah.
So this is Rachel, and so I know Megan has mentioned this before throughout the webinar, but one of the, I guess, probably one of the more powerful ways to use this tool is in this comparative framework. And so wherever there are uncertainties in knowledge, or the possibility that there might be, some relationship that is sort of embedded within all of these components that we've been talking about, and you might want to bring it out, like the ERC issue. I mean, one way to do it is because, when we're talking about climate projections, we're in the realm of multiple future possibilities, is that you would run this scenario for one of each of your assumptions, varying only that thing that you're assuming. So if it's about, seasonality of fires and the ecosystem response, or about, some nuance of seasonal climate and ERC, or whatever it is, you could make that, sort of name your particular run or whatever to indicate that, that was your assumption going in, and then use the tool to look at how that would play out, and then, vary that one assumption in some other manner, and then do the comparative, or look at the results in that comparative framework. Because I think often we know, sort of a couple of steps in this complex process of relating climate and fire and vegetation, but we might not know all of them, even in this sort of simplified tool. And so by testing those assumptions as different model runs, we might be able to pull out at least what we know, or what we can find out from data and literature about the relationships, without having to know all of these complicated, mechanisms that might create the relationships, if that makes sense.
Okay, I think that made great sense. So that's great. Okay, we are past our hour-and-a-half retime designation. I don't know, are there other questions? And you're more than welcome to write me an email, follow up, give me a call. Should be here. And yeah, and I'll definitely be in touch with some of you.
Thanks, Megan. This is Martha again. We can also continue via email to ask questions or discuss if people feel that's necessary. Craig, would you mind sending me an email with the email addresses of your staff who are on the call, and anybody else who you want to have added to this conversation, so that I can send out the recording so that they can watch that if they weren't able to attend, and then also my notes, and perhaps Megan could send out a copy of her PowerPoint for people that were interested.
Yes.
Yeah, I can do that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so this has been recorded. This recording will be available, and I'll send it out to folks who are here in case they want to review it. And I was taking notes on some of the questions that were asked, so I'll make those available too.